Yes, yes, y'all, and it won't stop. Let me ask you a question. Do you all remember involuntary functions? That's something that we learned in school. I don't recall if we learned about it in middle school or in high school, but I'm almost certain that we learned about involuntary functions in science class. It could have been anatomy or whatever. But feel free to leave a comment below. Let me know if you remember anything about involuntary functions. And the reason I bring this up because, of course, you know that I am breaking down chapter by chapter the book Atomic Habits by James Clear. Now, as I was going through chapter 3, it was something that I read in that chapter. It really just reminded me of involuntary functions. Now, for those of you who may not ever remember or need a reminder, need a freshening, so basically, involuntary functions, they include breathing, digestion, heartbeat, basically things that happen automatically, right? So those are what involuntary functions, those are examples of involuntary functions. Now, as I went back and I did a little research to kind of, just kind of remember exactly what involuntary functions are all about, I came across the key characteristics of involuntary functions. And some of those key characteristics are automatic, for one, which is these functions, they happen without active decision or will. Another key characteristics is unconscious control, which with these functions, they do not need to be thought about to make them happen. And then the third key characteristic I wanted to share with you is reflexive, which allow these functions to be quick and automatic responses. Now, again, I thought about involuntary functions because in the book Atomic Habits, James Clear defined specifically in chapter 3, he defined what a habit is. And his definition of habit, according to chapter 3, is that a habit is a behavior that has been repeated enough times to become automatic. Now, with that definition, that reminded me of at least one key characteristic of involuntary functions, and that is automatic, as I mentioned to you before. And what is automatic again? These are things that happen without active decision or will. Now, that's what habits all about. It is a behavior that has been repeated enough to become automatic. And it got me thinking about some habits that perhaps that we have that are somewhat similar to how it works in regards to involuntary functions. Now, whether you have good habits or you have bad habits, if you think about it, some of those habits we do automatically. We do involuntary. So think about it. That's something I want you to think about. So when it comes to the involuntary function of automatic, I think about, there are some certain habits that we may partake in. For example, for the smokers out there. Now, there are smokers out there who smoke cigarettes, and there could be a trigger as to why they smoke cigarette. It could be stress, right? They could have been like in a stressful situation at home or at work. So when they start to feel that stress, they feel the need to, get a cigarette, just spark it up with the lighter and just start smoking. I see that as an automatic response, similar to an involuntary function in regards to automatic. I feel like smokers automatically, whether it's stress or whatever the trigger may be, they'll just start smoking a cigarette. I feel like that's an example of automatic. When it comes to another key characteristic of involuntary function, there's the unconscious control. And when I think about that particular characteristic, some of the habits that come in mind is the overconsumption of social media, the overconsumption of being on the internet, watching TV. I see that as an example of unconscious control. Because if you think about it, for many of us, when we wake up in the morning, for many of us, what is the first thing we do? We want to grab that phone, right? We grab that phone. We want to check social media. We want to check emails. We want to just check the internet altogether, right? As if we're missing out on something. We want to see what we're missing out on. In some cases, in many cases, a lot of us, we do that. We'll be laying in the bed. We haven't got out of bed yet. As soon as we wake up, we grab that phone and we own it. We going down that rabbit hole. So I see that as unconscious control, which is a key characteristic of involuntary functions. Then there's reflexive. Reflexive is another key characteristic of involuntary function. And in regards to certain habits that we may have, the habit that comes to my mind perhaps is we're driving on the road, we're driving down the street, driving down the highway, right? We try to get to wherever we trying to get to. And then all of a sudden, some other driver just come out of nowhere and just do something crazy. It may be like a crazy lane change or whatever right in front of us, just cuts us off. And what many of us do, we start blowing the horn all crazy. We start hollering, yelling, acting a fool. We start cussing, this or that or whatever, right? That's what we do. That is our reflex. That is our reaction. And I see that as a habit that we have as well that is somewhat similar to involuntary functions. Now, it really got me thinking about certain habits that we have, whether they're good or not good habits. But some of these habits are similar to how involuntary functions work. I mentioned the key characteristics: automatic, unconscious control, reflexive. And it got me thinking, there are involuntary functions, and perhaps we have involuntary habits. If you think about it, if you look deep within yourself, if you do some soul searching, if you do some self inventory, you may discover that you have some involuntary habits. Think about that. So as we talk about these involuntary habits, another part of the book, James Clear goes into the process of habit formation. And there's a particular quote from that in regards to that. And it says, the process of habit formation begins with trial and error. So for example, when we are in the process of forming a new habit, because we trying to, kill our old habits. We want our old habits to die. Because a lot of time we discover that we have these bad habits, so we want to change for the better. So as we're going about this habit formation, trying to turn our bad habits into good habits, right? It takes trial and error sometimes. And how that works is that as we're trying to form these new habits, we fall short. We come across challenges. We have some issues. And as we're going along trying to develop new habits, we don't, get to the point where those habits come into fruition, right? So it happens like that, right? As we're forming new habits, we are a continued work in progress. And perhaps it doesn't always work out the way we want to, how we want to, when we want to. And that's pretty much how it works. Now, in regards to habit formation, it involves the brain. Now, I think about this, I go back to involuntary functions. Now, with these involuntary functions, I use the examples of breathing, digestion, heart beating, and there are a few other examples. Now, if you think about that, that is all controlled by the brain. There's a certain part of the brain that control our involuntary functions. There's a part of our brain that ensures that those involuntary functions are working like they're supposed to. Now, James Clear laid out something very well in chapter 3 in regards to how the brain works when it comes to our habits. It works the same way. When we are in habit formation, our brain is working. Our brain is working to ensure that, that we get to the point where our habits become involuntary. That's where it all starts. It starts in the brain. The brain is working out for us, right? So For example, let's say that you're trying to become a reader. And this kind of goes back to how trial and error works. If you're trying to become a reader, if you haven't really just been into reading books, but now all of a sudden you tell yourself, in order for me to get better in life, I need to start learning, I need to start doing this. So I need to start reading more books. Now it all starts with, at what point of time in my life can I start reading books on a consistent basis? And you try different times of the day. You may try the morning, and perhaps the morning doesn't work out for you. So then again, it's trial and error. So you try to figure out, okay, well, let me try the daytime. Maybe in the afternoon, after lunch or something like that. Maybe I can start reading on a consistent daily basis after lunch. And perhaps it may not work out for you then. And then you try another part of the day. Maybe at nighttime before you go to sleep. Now, regardless of what time of the day works for you, it's all about trial and error. You try, and you try. That's what it's all about. And that's what leads me to the feedback loop. That's another thing that was talked about in chapter 3 of the book, Atomic Habits by James Clear. He spoke about the feedback loop and how that works, how that comes together. So the feedback loop, basically, it is all about you try to, formulate a new habit. Perhaps you fail, but then from that failure, you learn. And then you just try differently. Just like the example that I laid out for you in regards to reading. You want to figure out what time of the day is good for you to read. Perhaps you may need to go into a different space, a different environment. You're just trying out different things, right? That's part of habit formation. That's part of the feedback loop. You try, you fail, you learn, you try again, you try differently. And then as you're going about it, that's all part of the habit formation. Until you get to the point where you want to turn that failure in the feedback loop, where it says try, fail, learn, and try differently. Now that fail part, we're going to continue to go through that feedback loop until we turn that fail part to pass. So once we get to the point where we really figure out, once we form that new habit and we want it to stick, and we turn that fail into pass. To that point, that's where that new habit has been formed, in which it becomes automatic. Think about it. So you got involuntary functions, what we talked about at the beginning. You see the correlation now. I hope that you see the correlation. I'm trying to make it make sense. So how involuntary functions work, I feel like it's similar to how formulating new habits work, to the point where if you can get to the point where your habits become involuntary, where it's automatic, where it is unconscious control, where it's reflexive, basically getting to the point where your good habits you do without thinking, you do without thought. It's automatic. And whenever you come across a situation, whenever you come across a challenge, that new good habit kicks in when it's necessary. Because in the book, it also says that all habits that are created, the level of in the brain activity, it decreases. So once it gets to that point where the habit becomes automatic, because as you're going through that habit formation and as you're going through that feedback loop, your brain is working and it's working and it's working and it's working. So again, the quote is, as habits are created, the level of activity in the brain decreases. So once that new habit is set in place, once it becomes involuntary, once it becomes automatic, then your brain becomes at ease. Peace and blessings to you as you continue your journey. So let me know what you think about that. We talked about at the beginning involuntary functions and how it is similar to our habits, how it works, between the brain working to form that new habit and all that good stuff. And we talked about the feedback loop. And I got some homework for you. I want to encourage you to once again do self-inventory. And I want you to think about your involuntary habits. Habits that are automatic, whether it's good habits, whether it's bad habits. Now, some of us, hey, I'm going to keep it real with you. We have some bad habits that are involuntary, that are automatic. Let's just be real with each other. I know I do, and I know when I was going into, as I was putting this topic together, putting these talking points together, I was just thinking about some of my bad habits that are automatic, that are involuntary. And in turn, we also have some good habits that are involuntary and that are automatic. So that's something I want to encourage you to think about. That is your homework. So once you do that, once you tap into that, feel free to leave a comment below. I would love to receive your feedback. I would love to receive what you have discovered about yourself as you kind of, just dive in and just discover and find out if you have some involuntary habits. Once again, leave a comment below. I would love to receive your feedback. I am Reggie B, aka the Growth Advocate, and I appreciate you all tuning into this episode of the Growth Times Infinity podcast. And be on the lookout for the next video because, we just broke down some parts of chapter 3. But in the next video, as we continue the series, Our Habitual Ways, I'm going to break down chapter 3 a little bit more in the next video. So be on the lookout for that. And until the next time, keep growing and keep going.